It's a pleasure to have you on our podcast. How are you doing?
Good, good. Thank you.
So, would you mind telling a little bit about yourself for the viewers?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Ahmad, and I'm an industrial organizational psychologist and program director at George Mason University of a master's program in industrial organizational psychology. I'm a native of Northern Virginia, born and raised in Woodbridge, and went to George Mason University for all of my degrees for undergraduate, where I had a bachelor's of arts in psychology and minor in Islamic studies. And then I went abroad on a Fulbright fellowship to do research in my gap year and took GREs abroad. And then I came back and got into the Mason's master's and PhD program in industrial organizational psychology. And so the way it worked is it's a terminal PhD program where you could get your master's along the way. So I did that. And after graduating with my PhD in IO, I went abroad to teach in a business school in Dubai, back in the United Arab Emirates, where I did my Fulbright. And and I did that for a few years before returning to Mason as a faculty member and program director to launch a fully online master's program in applied industrial organizational psychology. So that's a little bit about my educational and career path, and my research interests are in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I've conducted research in this space for about the last 15 years.
Awesome. What inspired you to go into researching diversity and inclusion?
When I was an undergrad and declared my major in psychology, similar to what a lot of other students do, that I thought it was focused on, helping people in the clinical counseling space. And when I was, I believe, a sophomore, I had looked into the counseling program at Mason, actually, and I saw that they required 1,000 hours working with kids or in that space. And so I started substitute teaching as well as being a teacher's aide. And I joined a social and emotional development lab. And that's how I sort of fell in love with research. And after being in that lab for a year, where we were looking at the social emotional readiness of preschoolers to go into school, I realized that faculty member, she encouraged me to apply for the departmental psychology honors program. And that first semester, while I thought I was going to stay in, the social emotional development lab, and I thought I was going to do a research or project in that space, that first semester, they do a great job in the program by having different faculty members come in and talk about their expertise. And that's when I first learned about industrial organizational psychology. And then I remember my faculty advisor, Dr. Eden King, came in and she talked about studying diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace, and how we all come from different backgrounds, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, educational backgrounds, and so many different backgrounds, and how people in the workplace are expected to work collaboratively together and maximize those diversity differences, but that doesn't always happen, and how those workplace experiences impact individuals and organizations, and how there's ways to sort of improve individuals' experiences. And the thing that kind of got me interested in IO and DEI was really, she said, in the clinical counseling space, you're impacting the people who come in and are seeking help or maybe even being recommended for help, but everybody needs to work or has somebody in their family that works for their livelihood, and workplace impacts everyone. So that's how I sort of got into the field of IO and fall in love with DEI.
I love that, and I definitely agree with everything you said about diversity and inclusion. Daniel, do you want to go on?
Yeah, so in terms of your research, when you were doing that research, which research did you find would be like the best, like correlation or meta-analysis or experiment?
I believe you're asking, like, what research method do I think is best? All of the research methodologies, they have their strengths and weaknesses, right? And we know that about all the research methodology. There's all of them have their pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses. But if you ask me which one's my favorite, I can give you, an overview. With correlational studies, they help us understand relationships between variables, but that's about it. And meta-analyses, they might synthesize a ton of research studies and provide an overview, but highlighting patterns across studies, but they're not um, in depth looking at specific causation. And qualitative methods is really it's important, I think, to do interviews and focus groups and look at deep topics. But my favorite, I would say, is experimental methods, because you can sort of manipulate an independent variable and see its effect on the dependent variables. So you can establish causality to better understand what's going on. And I would say field experiments are my absolute favorite, because while we might do experiments in the lab, on people who come in to participate in our research studies on campus, I think field experiments, they allow for external validity or generalizability into the broader population. And so I would say my favorite is field experiments.
Okay, so from the research conducted, did you think like demographics had any play in like groupthink or group polarization?
Are you talking about the demographics of participants in the research study?
Yeah.
So, in terms of demographics in the research study that I've done, we definitely try to, make sure that we have a diverse group of participants with broad perspectives so that they're less susceptible to polarization. And, there's a couple of things that, when it comes to groupthink, things like that, a lot of the studies we did not involve people being in a room together, right? Because when you think about groupthink and consensus building and so forth, it's typically if an experiment or study is done with multiple people in the room and everyone's sort of going along with one person. But a lot of the research studies I've done are field experiments where we're looking at interactions between individuals or surveys and things like that. So we don't have group setting data collections in the studies that I've done, so that mitigates some of those groupthink, challenges that mentioned and stuff. So we do being in the Northern Virginia area, we're not, prone to have homogenous groups in terms of race, gender, and culture and socioeconomic status. So we do have diverse populations that we're able to sample from, whether we're in the lab on campus or trying to collect data out in the fields.
Connie, do you want to ask the next question?
Yes. So I have read like your research article on on like evidence-based strategies for improving diversity and inclusion in undergraduate labs, and that just like got me thinking, like, how can like us as students in school and like in our part-time jobs help promote like diversity and be cognizant of like including those with different backgrounds than us in our lives?
I think with everything, it starts on being educated first and foremost on different approaches. So individuals can start self-educating by reading books, attending workshops, participating in affinity groups, engaging with media with diverse perspectives, even those that might not align with your own, just to have an idea of what people, their thought processes and what people think. So I think it starts with self-education, and those are some avenues or ways to do that through books, workshops, joining affinity groups, and engaging with media with different perspectives. And some ways that I do that is, even though I'm not a member of, but I am an ally of, Black colleagues, and so I've joined Blacks in IO Psychology, and I go to those conferences and engage with readings in that space to better understand those perspectives. So it starts with sort of that self-education journey. In addition, it's important to, like, as you start sort of diversify your thoughts in learning and engaging, you might diversify your social circle. Again, engaging with people from different backgrounds, cultures, and beliefs especially through food. I mean, that's a great way to do it. But, maybe think about different book clubs and things like that to join if you're trying to think about diversifying your social circle. But you mentioned, what should we do in our maybe school internships and workspaces and things like that? Speak up. I mean, challenge stereotypes, biased jokes, or exclusionary behavior. Y'all are teenagers, and I'm sure that there are a lot of jokes that are made amongst teenagers, but it starts with change by like challenging those biased jokes and saying, you know what? I know you made that joke and you may not have meant it, or I hope you didn't mean it, but that wasn't really appropriate and it could be hurtful because if we do that at every stage and every level, whether it's with other peers at the teenage level, those behaviors automatically get ingrained in your habits that you might carry over to the workplace as well. So speaking up in different settings, starting with your friends, family, and then extending that to the workspaces. And then in the classroom, organizations, clubs, and jobs, you can support and find ways to um, have inclusive policies. So I don't know, like if you have a club going on school, you could say something as simple as, what in terms of food, can we make sure we have vegetarian and non-vegetarian options, kosher and halal options, or dairy-free options? Like those are just inclusive small things that you could do. Even planning meals for people in clubs and organizations and classrooms and celebrations that are inclusive and show people that you care about their dietary restrictions and things like that. And finally, even as teenagers, you all can find ways to be in a mentoring role, like to younger kids in elementary school, because by supporting those, that's what brought me to doing this podcast today. Is that even though I have 20 years ahead of y'all, I continue to find opportunities or avenues to mentor, support those that might come from different backgrounds, different groups, and have fewer opportunities and may not be engaged directly with scholars and things like that. So you all can do that in your spaces too. I know I gave you all a ton of ideas and food for thought.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
thank you for saying all of that.
Yes.
I'd like to add a few things, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I know at our school, our school is actually very diverse. I heard, like, my history teacher has told my class, especially, that our school is, like, very diverse. And we've done a lot when it comes to, like, embracing that, especially we have this one event at our school that is called the Multicultural Festival, and I have also been a huge part in doing that this past school year, and I think it's like really amazing to be able to share food, do like a fashion show, and like we also had film contests like the past year. I think it's all like really amazing, and I think that it's really helped with like just being more inclusive and sharing diversity and all that.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome.
Of course.
Yeah, that was really good, and I really like your tips, especially like the food and stuff. It's just, yeah, I appreciate the little things, and we can just do to start like reinforcing habits of inclusivity and stuff. And on the topic of like events and initiatives to help with diversity, how do you think these have evolved over time? Like, where do you think that nowadays people are more like becoming more like cognizant of different people's beliefs and more accepting of like their cultural backgrounds? Like, how do you think? Basically, how do you think the initiatives to help increase diversity education have evolved over time?
That's a great question, and I could probably go on and on and on about that. So I'm going to try to provide a succinct answer. I think that it's been a pendulum shift. I think that, when I started this research in this space over 15 years ago, there were some groups that were being studied a lot more than others. So, for example, at that point in time, there was a ton of research on gender diversity, race diversity. And then we saw a shift. So my expertise and specialty was in incorporating, I had recognized back in 2005, 2006, that there wasn't a lot done in terms of religious diversity, in terms of the empirical research in that space. So that's how I started filling the gap in undergrad and graduate school with the research studies that I conducted. And so we started seeing an increase in that space, as well as research in the LGBTQ population. So we saw an increase in that, and then more and more acceptance. And then we saw a shift in the way that diversity was studied in terms of gender with the Me Too movement, as well as with racial diversity, with the social justice movement, with the George Floyd incidents, and all of that. And then you saw that at that time, you saw a huge pendulum shift where everyone was jumping on that bandwagon of being progressive when it comes to DEI, in self-educating, reading books. Perhaps the pandemic had a role where people were at home and had more opportunities to connect online in workshops and book groups and started doing that self-work on how to be anti-racist. And you saw a huge pendulum shift where so many organizations were putting out, promoting events and initiatives and book clubs and affinity groups and so forth, and just a lot of support in these spaces. And but then, unfortunately, in the last year or two, you've seen the pendulum shift backwards, and there's been a lot of backlash, and it happened so rapidly. Perhaps with the political shift and change in presidential, in the presidential options, and it, again, because now with the new president, you actually have a lot of these diversity initiatives becoming unlawful according to new laws and regulations. And so you see the Department of Education, school workplaces, and all that is receiving reprimands for engaging in these initiatives. And so you've seen the pendulum shift the other way. And so I think that it's been disheartening to see what's going on in this space. However, I remind myself that, similar to what we've seen in the past, I think the pendulum will always shift one way or the other. And I know that it's been uncertain in the current times based on what's been happening in the past and present, but I am hopeful in the future that, we'll see that pendulum shift the other way again.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
I'm hopeful of that too.
so moving forward, in terms of the workplace, what are specific ways do you think like diversity can positively impact the workplace in terms of like impact on team productivity?
Yeah, I mean, diverse teams, research has evidence that diverse teams are better at problem solving, innovation because of their diverse perspectives. They can improve final decision making by exposing folks to multiple viewpoints, to, again, what you mentioned earlier, to avoid groupthink. Employees feel more valued and motivated, inclusive environments. And in addition, diverse teams are reflective often of more diverse customer bases, and then that can increase the margin for bottom line and just financial benefits, because of those diverse ideas for marketing and products that can bring a wider market of customers in. So those are just some of the ways that diversity has positive effects in the workplace.
Okay, so you mentioned like creating like a kind of like a positive like area. So like how can we like sort of like um, raise awareness on like implicit bias and prevent like these like kind of like attitudes and like biases against other people who are like wanting to go into these research opportunities from preventing them?
So you're saying, how do you want to raise awareness in preventing implicit bias? So that's that one again. There's it's First and foremost, people need to understand what implicit bias is, right? And, it's that unconscious attitude or stereotypes that individuals have that impact our decisions or actions without our formal awareness, right? These biases could be related to race, gender, age, religion, disability, appearance, and anything else, right? So the first thing is, in terms of raising awareness, is just being like, you could have sessions or workshops that explain what implicit bias is, sort of how it manifests and why it matters. And a lot of people might say things like, well, I don't have any biases. And when I used to teach undergrads over a decade ago, I used to actually use the Harvard Implicit Association, or IAT test, and it would help individuals in the class sort of uncover their own unconscious biases. So they might start off saying, well, I don't have these biases against overweight people and this and that, or whatever it was. And then by doing this implicit association test, they found out they did. And so we're like, again, we're trying to remind you that you're not necessarily always aware of it. And then, so, first telling people what it is, how it manifests, and that other people, that folks have it, and sort of why it matters. And so having real world studies and examples, and that's where I think research is so rich and important, because I think that with research, you're not saying, hey, I'm just saying this or I believe this. You're saying based on research where they found evidence, empirical evidence for this, this is how it matters. And previous research has shown that, these implicit biases affects everything from the applicants we review to the way we train to the way we promote people in the workplace. All of that, it affects all of those levels. It even affects things in the classroom, the way those biases that some of the teachers might have towards students in certain groups might impact how supportive and helpful they are, and vice versa for students. So I think it's important that just making people aware and having these opportunities to have this dialogue, sharing books, podcasts, films, and articles that unpack some of this bias, I think would be a start, at least.
Okay, yep, I totally agree with that. So, you mentioned like applicants and like kind of like biases affecting that. So, how can we make sure like the qualitative essay approach diversifies these underrepresented groups and motivation for like taking AP classes, for example?
Could you elaborate on that? So, when you say the qualitative essay approach, explain what you mean. I'm not, yeah, what do you mean by, do they have to write an essay and take AP classes? Because you mentioned AP classes and then the qualitative essay approach. So, can you elaborate on what you mean by that or what happens in that process?
Yeah, so sort of like before they take the AP class, they kind of like so like in one of your research findings, there's like like there was like a group of like a bunch of like certain amount of a race, and they kind of like didn't feel like it was kind of like diverse. So I was thinking like if you were to like sort of have like the qualitative essay like for example like an applicant sort of like write an essay about like diversity before taking the AP class, like how could that like sort of change their motivation?
So, I don't think that, um, I think you're asking a very hypothetical question. And so, I, I think what you're asking is before someone takes an AP class, hypothetically, would you administer a qualitative essay and then score that essay and make sure we're not biased in scoring that essay and then allowing students to take the AP class? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that it would be important in the selection process to have both objective and subjective data. So, some objective data before taking an AP class would be something like your previous GPA, right? That's very objective. There's no arguing the difference between someone who has a 3.8 versus someone who has a 2.8. That's an objective criteria that we can have and utilize and say anyone who is signing up for AP classes should have above a 3.5, right? In terms of some of the subjective information, I think you would have to be very careful in creating a coding scheme for that qualitative essay and determine beforehand, just like with any job, we say that before you hire for any job, you need to do a thorough job analysis. And what that means is highlighting what are the tasks and qualifications of that job. Based on that job analysis, you would then come up with the job ad, and you would then come up with the selection measures. You would then come up with the way you train the individual and promote the individual, right? So similarly, I would have subject matter experts, both students in AP classes as well as faculty or teachers teaching AP classes, to come up with sort of a job analysis for a successful AP student. And then I would base, again, my selection measure on those criteria. So if and then that's how I would code the essay, is based on the qualifications that have been outlined by the subject matter expert, the current successful AP student, um, and in conjunction with the teachers who maybe score those successful AP students. So does that make sense on how I would, I guess, support that or ask for that endeavor to be done if that was going to be used, if a qualitative essay approach was going to be used to select an AP student?
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other final burning questions that I could answer that you have remaining?
Um, Connie, do you want to ask a question about the mentors?
Oh yeah. So like specifically, I know in your research article you talked about mentors attend to in order to like be more culturally aware and like um be inclusive of others, that they attend like seminars and do self-education on different cultures. And I think that those are some good qualities, like good actions a professor can or a mentor can take in when trying to include people in the research lab. But like, what do you think are maybe like the personal characteristics, like the intrinsic characteristics that professors or like mentors or teachers need to help support? Like, do they need to be more like um talkative, like talk to the students more? Like, what do you think?
So I think some characteristics of good mentors, especially for diverse students, I would say that they need to have, first and foremost, strong communication skills, be, active in and empathetic and listening to individuals, backgrounds and stories, and provide constructive feedback. I think having those communication skills is essential because, first and foremost, especially individuals from diverse backgrounds, um, they might not be comfortable sharing those things. So creating that safe space to allow that opportunity. There's certain teachers you guys might go to because you feel like you have more of a safe space to share your personal and professional challenges. So that's already a characteristic of having a strong communication capability, because they're able to talk to you all, listen empathetically, and to have open dialogue, right, about their identity, challenges, and aspirations. And then the second piece, being able to constructively provide feedback. I know a lot of times I'll meet with students, and at the end of the day, I can't just say good job, good job, good job, because that's not helping them in their growth. I do need to guide and mentor them on how to do better. And there's it all depends on I think the tone and the way that message is delivered, because there are some mentors that, again, their intention is good to help with that professional growth, but because of the way they deliver that message, that student might fall into the trap of believing they can no longer pursue a degree in that area or do anything, and they might feel defeated. So I think I would sort of identify the strongest characteristics is having strong communication skills, to be able to listen, have dialogue, and provide constructive feedback. And secondly, I think it's important that mentors, just have cultural humility and recognize that they don't know everything about everyone's backgrounds and their lived experiences. And again, making thoughtful questions to understand and meet those individual needs would really be helpful in that mentoring process.
Yeah, that's very insightful. And yeah, I do think that personal like communication is probably it is an important part of that. And yeah, that's a good idea.
Awesome. I think one last thing that I'd love to close off this podcast with is, I believe there was a question that you all had about what advice I'd give somebody who was interested in pursuing a degree in psychology. I think that I think that psychology is a fascinating area and a major for folks to go into in undergrad and then pursue on in graduate school. I think that a lot of times people don't know of all the specializations or subfields. So first, if anyone's interested in the field of psychology, I would encourage them to understand the breadth of psychology and know it's a very diverse field with so many specializations. So you have the clinical and counseling that most of us are familiar with. Then you have school and educational psychology, which might relate to providing special needs support or gifted support. You have industrial organizational psychology that deals with workplace dynamics. You have health psychology, forensic psychology, developmental psychology. You have, neuropsychology. And so there's a lot of different subfields in psychology. And even at George Mason University, we have different specializations for folks to do a concentration in undergrad or go into graduate study. Second, I would tell students to start early in building a strong academic foundation. So you all mentioned AP classes. Absolutely. Taking challenging courses in high school and demonstrates interest in pursuing higher education. So especially in psychology, if you all have an AP psychology class, if you all have statistics, taking that in math, because psychology is a lot of statistics, understanding human behavior, using statistics and data. And so, build that strong academic foundation by taking challenging courses, maintaining a high GPA, and getting involved in research. If you have the opportunity to do research projects at the high school level, I would encourage that. Third, find ways to get relevant experience. Find if you can get an internship or shadow somebody or interview somebody in some of the spaces you might be interested in. Find out if there's student organizations you can join at your level. So those are some things to think about at the high school level. And then when you get to undergrad, developing research skills is really important. Learning that, again, all these recommendations we make in psychology is based on data analysis. It's based on research that we do. And so getting comfortable in those spaces in undergrad, using SPSR, Python, coding, and doing statistics and presenting at conferences and publishing, all of that are things that you can start at the undergrad level to prepare people for graduate school. And most psychology degrees do require at least a master's degree. And then you have options to do a PhD or PsyD, depending on your interest. And so for someone interested in the field of psychology, I encourage them to start looking at all of those steps and consider what they can do at the high school level, and then plan, proactively at the undergrad level to set them up for success for graduate school later on.
Yeah, thank you so much for the advice. And just to say, we are all very grateful to have you come on our podcast and talk. And we learned a lot, and it was very eye opening. And I'm sure we are equipped to help include diversity in our lives and pursue our studies further in psychology.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.